beyond Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland, beyond Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland, it's beyond Northern Ireland.
Speaking of kind of this idea of a more global situation, have there been many examples of NI or of countries similar to NI kind of adopting a UBI-esque system? Has there been many kind of case studies, kind of post-conflict kind of
So the
countries?
post-conflict angle is obviously the focus point of my research, and there is nowhere that has done a UBI. The bet, and that's probably why I got the funding for my research, because it is, unique, and that makes it both difficult and interesting as a project.
Yes.
But what I have looked at, I've looked at evidence from UBI trials in developed countries, your Canada, California, Barcelona, Finland, and those all have different types of UBI trial, and go into the relative merits and dismerits of each of them if you wish. But what I wanted to look at is where money has been given to people post-conflict to try and bring about peace or reconciliation. So there is a lot of examples of cash transfer programs and generous microfinance programs. The cash transfer programs are a mix of conditional and unconditional payments. But there is examples, particularly in African and Asian nations, where that has been done. There's a project in Sri Lanka that I've got some good links to that's currently having research done on it with war widows of the Sri Lankan conflict. There was a really interesting one in the Philippines, given to communities with lots of paramilitary violence, where it actually reduced paramilitary activity. There's been evidence from Uganda, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, all of places where communities have been given cash transfers post-conflict, and it has helped with reconciliation and helped, most importantly, in communities with high levels of poverty. It's helped ex-combatants reintegrate back into society, because it's not sustainable after conflict to reintegrate people back into poverty. Because then you have often the same grievances, the same desires to get involved in illegal activity, and that can then spur into conflict. And a lot of African conflicts are based around resources, around land, around things like that. So, but that's not a million miles away from the causes of the Northern Ireland conflict. Of course, the political, social, and legal discrimination against the Catholic community was the #1 driving factor of the conflict. But you also have had huge amounts of economic discrimination around benefits and around housing and around employment, and huge levels of inequality and poverty, particularly in those Republican working class communities, where maybe 2/3 of children were born into poverty. So whilst a lot of the institutional and legal issues were addressed through the Good Friday Agreement, at the crux of my thesis is the idea that we haven't resolved the lingering issues around paramilitarism, and particularly young people getting involved in paramilitarism and organized crime aspects of that. It's not your standard, planting bombs and your political attacks and all that. We know that, but there is still a high level of paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland, and in fact, it's increased by 60% over the last, I think, 5 to 10 years. So you still have a massive undercurrent of that problem, and my argument is a lot of that is because those same communities who were most affected by the Troubles, who maybe had the highest recruitment for the IRA, for the UDA, are still those communities that are most deprived in Northern Ireland today. It's still, the same wards in the top 20 multiple deprivation index. And a lot of those issues around involvement with paramilitarism and an inability to sustainably reintegrate with society is as a result of not having a fair enough economic settlement as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. What you basically had was a continuation of a neoliberal agenda, which focused on a growth-led strategy, gentrification in Belfast, urban cloning, foreign direct investment, public-private partnerships, welfare reform being a really shocking example, which has pushed so many more people into poverty and possibly into the grips of getting into debt with paramilitaries and drug dealing and stuff like that. And there's evidence and research on that. And so there has been a peace dividend through the Good Friday Agreement, undoubtedly, and people are better off. And you go into Belfast, it's a beautiful city now, you walk along the Lag and it looks great. But in those communities, it's still largely the same. So the argument that I'm making is the peace dividend has paid out, but it hasn't paid out equally. And those communities that suffered the most are arguably in need of a much greater payment, and they haven't got a single penny.
Yeah, I think that also touches on the idea of like how these issues get framed in kind of not just a media, but also I guess a political context of, as you're saying, a lot of this is kind of an economic issue that needs to be addressed in such a way. But the only way that we ever talk about kind of paramilitarism and this kind of thing, just the way, because the way our politics is framed is obviously orange and, you know, green. It's effectively easier just to kind of blame the other side, or to say that it's this community issue, than to actually, I suppose, figure out the kind of economic ways of actually helping these people. But I mean, you can see that in America, you can see that, and I guess that is one of the things that does reassure you somewhat, that, as you were saying, there are other places who have like kind of these conflicts, and while we want to think of Northern Ireland as being unique in the kind of world, I guess we are in some ways. Just, you know, you can look at like Bosnia or Cyprus or any of these kind of post-conflicts and see the trends that follow in all these places that just go on again and again. But then these places sometimes do actually, as you were saying, in these areas, there are ways to improve. There are ways to hopefully see good things happen. You know, not just continually bad things, and hopefully that does happen with UBI.